CGTN headquarters in Beijing. This is The Hub with Wang Guan.
Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing. Donald Trump has officially returned to the White House as the 47th President of the United States. In just a few days back in office, he has wasted no time at all reigniting his signature America First agenda, from renaming the Gulf of Mexico to imposing steep tariffs and reshaping immigration laws. His latest policies are already sending ripples across the globe. Is Donald Trump's America First 2.0 a new chapter, or will we be seeing a familiar tune? First of all, here's my take. Now, January 20th in 2017, 8 years ago, I was there, right there on the steps of the Capitol in the thick of history, watching the first inauguration of a president whose brand of politics would shake the very foundations of U.S. foreign policy. I woke up that morning at 5 a.m., passed through tight security of the Capitol, and stood in the cold for 6 long hours, which is quite all right. An experience I'll never forget. But what struck me was wasn't just the bitter cold, of course, of Washington or the crowd. It was the speech. A phrase in particular stood out: America First. That was not just a slogan. It later on became a framework for policy decisions that defined Donald Trump's very first term in office. Now, fast forward to 2025, another inauguration speech, and there it is again, the promise to make America far more exceptional than it already is. But here's where things start to raise eyebrows. Now, U.S. exceptionalism is a term. It is a concept that has stirred global debates over the years and decades. Now, to many, U.S. exceptionalism, it comes across as a thinly veiled tool for diplomatic pressure, double standards, and yes, a colonialist mindset. The world doesn't need more of that. We need cooperation, not more insistence on one country's superiority over the others. Take, for instance, Trump's recent comments about the Gulf of Mexico and, of course, his newly signed executive order, which he humorously referred to as the Gulf of America, or more controversially, his comments about the Panama Canal. Let's clear the air. The Panama Canal was transferred to Panama under the 1977 Torrijos-Carter treaties. The U.S. has no claim to it anymore. So when those remarks about taking back Panama Canal are made by Donald Trump, it runs counter to international law, to long-established diplomatic agreements. And the world has reacted. Just look at Panama's president's reaction, his firm rejection over the idea or the proposal made by Donald Trump. And on tariffs, Trump's economic policies have always been rooted in the idea of external revenue generation through tariffs. But let's just pause here. The theory sounds simple enough, but it doesn't hold water. It doesn't add up in practice. Let's consider the U.S.-China trade war. When the U.S. launched tariffs back in 2018 against China, the U.S. trade deficit with China stood at around $350 billion US. Now, fast forward to the year 2023, it barely moved, holding steady at around $380 billion. Now, tariffs have cost Americans about $186 billion US since 2018. Every second the trade war drags on costs the American public around $800. And don't forget Trump's threats to Canada, floating the idea of 25% tariffs on steel, only to be met with a stern response from Justin Trudeau. And let's not forget the bigger picture. Donald Trump's withdrawal from international agreements like the Paris Climate Accord and his stance on drill, baby drill, send a message of American isolationism. The U.S. left the World Health Organization at a time when the world has just fought a major pandemic, are still fighting future ones to come. Now, the EU and the WHO rightfully raised alarms. America's health and climate politics cannot and should not exist in a vacuum. Isolationist policies, while politically popular with some, ultimately leaves everyone more vulnerable. Now, on China, the trade wars and technology restrictions during Trump's first term in office were meant to slow China down, were meant to slow China's rise, but look at what happened in reality. They only fueled China's domestic innovation. The development of the 7-nanometer Kirin 9000 chip by Huawei, which, by the way, have been under U.S. sanctions for years on end, is a prime example. Instead of stifling China's technological ambitions, it only accelerated them. And while sanctions may have aimed at crippling China's tech sector, they also push China to be more self-reliant and innovate at a faster pace. So what does all this mean for U.S.-China relations going forward? Well, one thing is certain. When the two countries cooperate, both sides benefit, and when they confront, both sides set to lose. And global peace and economic prosperity of the 21st century requires the two countries cooperate, not confront each other. Now, despite the rhetoric of past years, there are signs that U.S.-China relations can evolve into something more stable. The call between President Xi Jinping and President Donald Trump was a positive signal that was been interpreted very positively by analysts from around the world. It is clear that both countries, both nations must recognize that their futures are intertwined. A world that thrives, be it in terms of global trade, climate stability, or technological advancements, require China and the U.S. to work closely together. The world needs a new chapter, one of collaboration, treating each other as equals, and forward-thinking leadership, such as the concept of building a community of shared future proposed by the Chinese President Xi Jinping. Now, for a deeper analysis and more discussions into Donald Trump's policies and global repercussions, we're joined by a distinguished group of panelists here with me. In Beijing, we have Professor Xie Tao, Dean of the School of International Relations and Diplomacy at Beijing Foreign Studies University. Also in Beijing, we have Charles Liu, Senior Fellow at the Taihe Institute. And in Shanghai, Josef Mahoney is Professor of Politics and International Relations at East China Normal University. Professor Xie, let me turn to you first. We noticed that there are 13 members of Trump's cabinet who are not millionaires, but billionaires, 13 of them. How do you read this policy signal?
To understand this, I think you need to go into the mindsets of conservatism or the core tenets of conservatism, because conservatism values hierarchy and superiority. So the superiority of a certain group of people and the inferiority of a large number of people. So when you have the billionaires, at least for Trump and others, they prove their superiority. By becoming billionaires, they become so-called the captain of industries. And so the worship of a successful businessman and the worship of a military hero are the dual, I would say, idols of American conservatism. So you look at Donald Trump's first administration, there are a lot of generals.
Yeah.
And so now you see, even in the first one, you have quite a few billionaires. And so in the second one, you just mentioned the 13 billionaires. And so you can see this is a very interesting way to look at the mindset of conservatism.
Thank you for this academic and historical background. But does this constitute a conflict of interest at all? When you think about Elon Musk, who has been a great friend of China, of course, and a captain of the U.S. corporate world as well, steering, Tesla, SpaceX, and at the same time heading, the federal government's Ministry of Government Efficiency. Does this constitute, a conflict of interest at all?
Well, for Donald Trump and his associates, they think, no, because government has to be governed by people who are capable, people who are competent. And so how you can prove that you are competent? Well, if you are the boss of a multi-billion company, right? And so I think, that's their mindset. Forget about conflict of interest. Our only criteria is whether you can prove yourself a successful businessman or manager, either in the government or in business.
Does this run the risk of turning the U.S. government or American society in general into an oligarchy?
Exactly, Wang Guan. So there's already a lot of discussion about the rise of oligarchy in a so-called liberal democracy. And so why do you see so many billionaires in Donald Trump's administration? This is obviously, no matter where you go, people would define oligarchy exactly the way that you just see. Yeah.
Well, there are so many things that raise eyebrows. For example, Donald Trump's inauguration speech reference to the Gulf of America, so-called, of course, quote unquote, and now he signed an executive order declaring the Gulf of Mexico into the Gulf of America. With all due respect to our friends, in Mexico and across Latin America, Charles, what do you think? What do you think this tells us about Donald Trump's leadership in a Trump 2.0 cabinet?
I think you have already identified it in your startup statement that this is exceptionalism, colonialism, hegemony, imperialism, the concept of taking Gulf of Mexico, which is what the entire world and Mexico stand by, making it the Gulf of America is absurd. I don't know how long that will last on the global maps and the history books, but this is all part of his attempt to be dominant over the rest of the world, like with the tariffs that he's going to impose on his allies, on the EU, on Canada, on Mexico. It would be completely disastrous for Mexico because Mexico exports 80% of its goods to the U.S. It's 80% of its exports are to the U.S. And most of it is intermediate goods, which means 25% crossing the border each time would be totally disastrous for Mexico. So you have an issue of America first, to hell with the rest of the world. This is not going to go down well.
Yeah, I know. A fierce response from Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada. A stern response from the President of Panama. We've yet to hear from the Mexican authorities by the time of this broadcast, but I'm sure their response is to be made. Joseph, how do you look at Donald Trump's very aggressive, posture against first of all the Greenland and later on the Panama Canal and the Gulf of Mexico and also the tariffs on his closest allies?
There's been a discussion over the last several years that the world has sort of entered a major change, that we see countries, great powers, being more aggressive as regional powers, trying to reassert their spheres of influence. Now, this is certainly the narrative that the United States advances against China in the South China Sea, and certainly the same thing the U.S. advances against Russia in terms of its issues with Ukraine, Georgia, and others. But at the same time, we've also heard similar narratives about Turkey and Greater Israel. And certainly we see now the United States, I think, trying to imagine that it could project power much more than it already has into Canada and Greenland. And likewise into the Gulf of Mexico, as well as the Panama Canal and Mexico itself. So this, I think it's premature to say that this is indicative of a new normalization of sort of a new era of great power competition and hegemony seeking. But this will be something that we're all watching and concerned about. At the same time, we also know that there are a couple other issues at stake. One of them is that the new paradigm, and it's not new, it's been something we've been talking about for a couple of decades, is that the key to global security is whoever controls the North and South poles, which becomes even more dear with global climate change, global warming, melting the ice and snow, and certainly the increase problems that we've seen related to extreme weather in the global South, but also the American South, Southern California, Florida. So there's this idea that whoever can exert power over the North Pole, whoever has greater access to the global North, whether it's Russia, whether it's Canada, that they'll have strategic benefits. Certainly in Greenland, there would be a lot of strategic benefits potentially in terms of resources there that the U.S. believes has strategic importance, as well as in Antarctica. So we may be in the midst of sort of a major new change with the U.S. being a little more candid and open in ways that we've grown accustomed to with Trump. But at the same time, it may just be posturing for trying to strong-arm new trade deals out of Mexico
so Joseph,
and Canada.
Very quick follow-up. Just out of curiosity, what would happen in reality now that there's an executive order naming it the Gulf of America? Would American school kids, through their textbooks, now read the Gulf of America in their textbooks? What can the executive order from the White House do, as U.S. is it's the federal government, but there are the state municipal governments as well who have very strong powers. That's the first question. Second question, Panama Canal, but it is a 1977 bilateral treaty between Jimmy Carter and then President of Panama, which a treaty is an international law, says, there's a transfer of Panama Canal sovereignty back to Panama. What would happen in reality?
Well, I think in the case of Panama, to go to that very directly, what Trump has targeted, I think, are the Chinese companies that hold the contracts on both sides of the canal, and this idea that these companies would somehow fall under Beijing control and could therefore pose a risk to American military transits and commercial transits there, which is, kind of imaginative. Nevertheless, Trump has said with regard to Greenland and Canada that he's willing to consider both economic and military coercion to get what he wants. And we can imagine that he might provide direct both against Panama and even the Chinese companies or China itself to try to displace those Chinese contracts in Panama. And this may be the real goal and not reclaiming the canal. That may just be the thing that he said. Now, as far as the books, it's interesting because generally Republicans tend to be conservative with regard to education. We've had previous administrations talking about abolishing the Federal Department of Education. They've never done this because they end up trying to use it to spread their own ideological values. But there are, I think you will see is that there will be some so-called red states that do have control over their local education, and certainly you'll have some areas where you have local school boards that will be Republican and very Trump-friendly, who will be encouraging textbooks and lessons that emphasize, this new naming. But you'll also have places resisting, and perhaps you'll even see the Department of Education, if they really want to make a big deal out of it, threatening to hold off on various funds unless they make certain changes that are in ideological line with the Trump.
You know what? Maybe Trump can start thinking about naming the state of New Mexico into New America as well. Who knows, right? Professor Xie Tao, let me turn to you. The tariffs, right? Donald Trump finally threatened 10% tariffs on Chinese goods, which is less than the number he threatened on Mexico, on Canada. What's your reading of this gesture?
I think the broad community here in China, decision makers, analysts are expecting some sort of tariff from the new Donald Trump administration. We know what he did over a couple of years ago, right?
Of course.
And he keeps threatening to do this again, even though Donald Trump is notoriously unpredictable. But I think on tariff, he's been very consistent. And you look at Chinese analysts' commentaries, and most of them are offering, suggestions along the way that China, number one, will fight back. That's a very resolute, response from the Minister of Foreign Affairs and other people. Second, China is far better prepared to engage with the United States on a trade war or tariff dispute, whatever you call this, compared with when Donald Trump was first launched the war in 2018. Third, I think most Chinese analysts and also Chinese government is doing this is that to boost Chinese domestic demand, and so that we don't have to rely so much on the overseas market, right? So in a word, we should never underestimate Donald Trump's threats, number one. So we should not be overly optimistic. Remember back when he first was sworn in, a lot of people say Donald Trump is a businessman. The easiest way to deal with a government is to deal with a businessman. But turned out how terribly wrong that was, right? Yeah. So second, I think China is in a far better position. Chinese leadership, Chinese, all these bureaucrats are far more experienced in dealing with these challenges from Washington, D.C. And second, China is growing far more capable, so more experienced and more capable in responding to U.S. provocations.
Charles, let me turn to you. You've been observing the Chinese corporate activities and their outreach to the world. You advised some of them, facilitated some of them. So tell me about your sense of where China stands when it comes to potential tariffs or actions from the Trump administration against China. As America talks about reshoring, friendshoring, China has also diversified its trade in the investment portfolio as well, no?
Absolutely. China has been doing this for a number of years now. I think what's really important in the Chinese context is the global south. For example, the Belt and Road Initiative build infrastructure for many, many global south countries. With the infrastructure goes the flow of goods, the flow of supply chain, and integration of more efficient productive capacity on a global basis. What tariffs does, of course, is goes against efficiency. It goes to disrupt the supply chain. What we see now in terms of China's context is integration of ASEAN countries' economies into the China supply chain and the Chinese market, and increasingly the South American economies as well. Next is the Middle East, Central Asia. All of this is happening as we speak. I think what is significant is for the whole world to see that what Donald Trump is projecting in terms of what he wants to do, America first, is actually a disruption of the global economic growth. It's a disruption of the attempt of development by the developing countries, by the global south. And this is something that is now very clear in everybody's eyes, what the US is, what Donald Trump is projecting. Like, for example, what he's doing with Mexico, it's going to be absolutely disastrous. But now we are into Belt and Road version 2.0. 1.0 was building infrastructure. Now it's increasing trade. It's more efficient supply chains and more flow of people and goods. So I think China is well prepared to handle this in a positive manner.
There are other centers of power who are bracing for Trump's actions, for example, the European Union. Joseph, let's talk about this. Donald Trump reiterated his intention right now, to impose tariffs on European goods. We've heard from the European leader, Madame von der Leyen, saying that it would be a global race to the bottom should the United States went ahead and levied all those tariffs. What would be the dynamics between the European Union and the United States in the short term, in your opinion?
Well, I think one of the things that we've already seen from her, from the leader of the European Commission, is a willingness to accommodate Trump. I think we saw her sort of bending over backwards in the last week on offering to cooperate on anti-China initiatives. And this is what I hear from a lot of diplomats, that she wants to play ball with Trump and is trying to avoid getting hit. I don't know that she would be able to really represent a unified position in Europe or in the European Commission on China. There's a lot of division there, but it's also clear that Trump has his own agenda vis-a-vis Europe, Russia, and China, and none of these necessarily interact in some sort of meaningful way. Certainly, Europe is very, very concerned about what he's going to do with Ukraine and how he might interact with Putin. He said that he wants to meet Putin as soon as possible, and that's sort of nauseating for most European leaders, given the extent to which they've demonized Russia and the Russian leadership over the last several years. So I think Europe is in a very difficult position. It's very exposed in terms of the energy and security trap it faces with respect to Washington, and the extent to which Washington will still try to extract, I think, concessions that undermine the European and Chinese relationship, but also at the risk of going around Europe ultimately and creating their own deals with countries that like China or Europe that Europe may be willing to sell short.
Yeah. I want to talk about international relations. Professor Xie, during Trump's first term in office, the sense was that he kind of cut Russia some slack, focused on aggressively dealing with China. There were some divisions, frictions between the U.S. and the European Union back then. Judging from his cabinet picks, Rubio as Secretary of State, among others, what's your prediction about America's foreign policy under Trump 2.0?
I would say that Trump 2.0 would be far more calculated, would be more stable because of his very heavily vetted team this time. You mentioned Marco Rubio, unlike his first Secretary of State. He was a senator and he's very well respected, even though he's kind of a household name in China because he was on the sanction list, right?
Yeah.
And then you look at his national security advisor, who also served in Congress, and you look at the Secretary of Treasury, you can get a sense that this time the team of foreign policy is much more mature. And they probably would be more balanced in their approach to the overall global security. There already was news reports that Donald Trump had a pretty harsh message for Vladimir Putin about ending the war in Ukraine as soon as possible. Unlike you would expect that a few years ago that Trump would try his best to butter up with Vladimir Putin, right? So I think there should be some surprises, but not as big a surprise as when during his first term. So I would expect much more continuity and predictability compared with his first term.
Very interesting take. Charles, would you agree? What would you say about Trump's foreign policy approach and the posture against other major powers?
I think he has so many problems to deal with at home that they will be less focused on making a big show in the foreign policy side, because the domestic conflict, the problems that he has domestically are so intense, and the splitting of the left and right forces and the issues that he has to address are actually very, very difficult to address. And so they will be more focused on domestic issues than foreign side.
But what about his approach towards China?
His approach towards China, I think, will be more positive than Biden. Biden tried to round up a global alliance against China, but his America First agenda is preventing him from doing that because he's causing trouble with European countries. His allies, like Canada and Mexico, are finding themselves to be really in big trouble to be US allies. So I think this is going to be a major issue for him. Domestic problems and none of the obedience of the former allies that Biden rounded up against China. We see that already. Van der Leyen had talked about, of course, U.S. positive note on collaborating with the U.S., but she's also made very strong statement about collaborating win-win with Chinese negotiations and collaboration, all in the last few days.
All right, we're going to leave the final words to Professor Xie Tao. Any final thoughts?
Well, I would say just be careful that don't repeat the mistakes that some of our analysts and the government officials made when Donald Trump was first elected. And so at that time, there was this, I would use the word euphoria, that finally we have somebody who can easily be manipulated because of his business background. Right now, I think there's another surge of this kind of overt optimism. I would caution against that optimism.
All right, gentlemen, that's all the time we have. Joseph, we'll have you back next time to have more insights from you as well. Joseph, Charles, and Professor Xie, thank you so much. And thank you for watching The Hub on CGTN. Our news coverage continues. Bye and take care.